Okay, so you want to build a deep water container port. Pick a coastline. Dig a channel deep enough for the biggest ships on Earth. Pour a dock. Line up the cranes. And then sit back and watch the giants arrive, one after another, each one paying you a fee for every single box it carries. You are building the front door to global trade. The phone in your pocket crossed an ocean to get to you, and it came through a door like this one. The food on your table, the parts in your car, the medicine in your cabinet, almost all of it passes through a handful of doors like this one. Sounds simple, it is anything but. And the story of how deep water ports actually make money and how they actually die is one of the strangest stories in all of infrastructure. Because before you pour a single bucket of concrete, you need to understand what you're actually building, what it costs to win, and why the answer to all of it has almost nothing to do with the ocean. Here's what nobody tells you when they picture a port. The water is concrete. The flow is the bet. The most expensive structure on Earth can be finished, look magnificent from the air, and still be a ghost. Because the thing that makes a port valuable was never the port. First, understand what a deep water port actually is. Strip away the water and the concrete, and what's left is a machine for moving boxes. One box comes off a ship, gets lifted by a crane, drops onto a truck or a train, and that is the entire product. The fee you charge is per box. The capacity you brag about is boxes per year. The ships are measured in boxes. The whole place is designed around a single idea. Move the box from the water to the land as fast as possible. Because every minute a box sits on a dock is a minute nobody gets paid. The port that moves the most boxes in the least time wins. The port that moves the fewest loses, whether it looks busy or not. Which means your first question is not how do I build a dock? It's how do I get the boxes in the first place? Because nobody builds a deep water port for the pleasure of watching it sit there. The entire industry runs on a single assumption, that there is cargo behind the water. And the whole game is getting that cargo onto the biggest ships you can. And that's where the first big misunderstanding shows up. Most people picture the port as the thing that made the ships possible. It's the other way around. The ships drove the ports. For decades, container shipping ran on a brutal logic. Bigger ships meant cheaper boxes, so the ships kept getting bigger. And the biggest ones now carry around 24,000 boxes and need roughly 50 feet of water beneath them to sail full. At a shallower port, those ships either can't call at all, or they sail half-empty. And a half-empty megaship is a slow-motion disaster, because the entire economics of those ships depend on packing them to the top. So the biggest ships go where the water is deepest, and the shallow ports get skipped or served by smaller ships that cost more per box. Here's the arithmetic. A shallow port can add $200 to $500 to the cost of moving a single box. Every extra foot of depth saves roughly $20 to $30 per box. Run those numbers across a ship carrying 20,000 boxes, and you're talking about millions of dollars per voyage. That's why ports across the United States and Europe have spent billions over the last few decades just to win the depth race. Charleston, Houston, Savannah, Virginia, all of them poured money into deepening channels toward that 50-foot mark. Because every port knows what happens to the one that stays too shallow. The big ships skip it. Depth isn't vanity, it's a pricing weapon. So what does it cost to win? Let's do the math. The rough benchmark in the industry is about $500 per box of annual capacity. That's an estimate, not a contract price, but it's the number people in this business actually use to size a project. A port that can handle 2 million boxes a year starts at around $1 billion. A port that wants to handle 10 million boxes a year, which is what a serious modern port looks like, starts at around $5 billion. And that's before the dredging gets difficult, before the rock shows up, before the land has to be clawed out of the sea. A single ship-to-shore crane, the kind that reaches across a vessel the size of a small city, costs $20 to $30 million and lives for 25 or 30 years, and a megaship berth needs 2 or 3 of them, just for one berth. Then there's the channel itself, the thing that never stops costing you money. The ocean doesn't stay where you dug it. Sediment moves back in, year after year. A port sitting at a muddy river mouth can spend $20 to $50 million a year just to keep the channel deep enough for the ships that matter. And even a clean coastal port spends $10 to $15 million a year fighting the same fight. The water is the most expensive thing you'll ever buy, and it's also the thing that never stops asking for money. And the way these projects get paid for only makes it worse. Most big ports aren't bought like a building. They're built on concessions, where a private operator gets the right to run the port for 20 to 40 years, borrows the construction money, and then has to pay the debt back out of the fees, which means the pricing pressure starts the day the shovel goes in, not the day the ships arrive. But here's the part that catches every first-time builder off guard. When you borrow the money to build a port, and you always borrow the money. The interest starts the day the loan arrives, not the day the first ship docks, not the day the first box moves. The day the money hits your account, the clock starts, and every month of construction delay is a month of interest on billions of dollars with zero revenue coming in. This is the structural problem at the heart of every megaproject, and ports are the purest version of it, because a port has no revenue at all until it's finished. A factory can sell something partway through construction. An apartment building can start renting floors before the top is done. A port is all or nothing. The channel has to be deep enough, the cranes have to be up, the terminal has to work. And until that day, every single dollar is going out and nothing is coming in. A port that takes years longer than planned doesn't just cost more, it bleeds more, quietly, the entire time, and there is nothing you can do about it except finish. But let's say you finish, the water is deep, the cranes are up, and you're finally charging a fee for every box. This is the part where the dream usually dies, because the toll booth is not the business. The fee you charge per box is a thin margin on a machine that costs billions to run, and the bills don't stop. Maintenance dredging runs tens of millions of dollars a year. The cranes need constant service and they'll be replaced long before the debt is paid off. The terminal needs power, security, and a workforce around the clock, whether 10 ships call this month or 10,000. The lights stay on whether you're busy or not. The only thing that changes with volume is your revenue. So a port that wants to survive has to push enormous volumes through the same fixed bill, which is why throughput becomes the god of this industry. And that's where the visible scoreboard starts lying to you. Throughput is not income. A port can post a record year for boxes and still lose money, because the debt service on the build is so large that only the biggest ports in the world can cover it, and even they run on margins so thin you could mistake them for a public service. And here's the trap that people miss when they look at a busy port from the outside. They see the cranes, they see the ships, they see the numbers climbing, and they assume the port is rich. But the port's real product was never the fee. The port's real product is the land behind the dock. The warehouses, the factories, the distribution centers, the jobs, the tax base, the city that grows up because the flow exists. Every box that moves through a deep water port is a vote for the economy behind it, and the value of that vote lands on the land, not on the water. A funnel only works when something flows through it. Charge a thin fee per box, and watch the region behind the water get fat. The people who understand this build ports for what they unlock, not for what they charge. Which brings us to the part of this business that almost nobody sees from the outside. The port doesn't control the flow. A handful of shipping lines and alliances decide which ports the megaships call at, and one route change on a map drawn in an office on the other side of the world can empty a terminal that cost billions to build. The lines don't need your port, you need them. And behind the ships, the flow depends on what people in this business call the hinterland. The entire region that feeds the port, the trucks, the trains, the factories, the customers, the whole economy that produces the boxes in the first place. If the factories don't exist, if the roads don't exist, if the customers don't exist, the boxes don't exist, and the most beautiful deep water terminal on Earth is just a very expensive parking lot for the sea. And even when the flow does exist, it doesn't automatically belong to you. Ports compete for the same cargo, and a newer, deeper, better connected port a few hundred miles away can quietly pull your hinterland out from under you. The port is the last thing in the chain, not the first. It's where the flow comes out, and it has no say in whether the flow shows up. And that's exactly what makes the biggest bet in the history of this business so interesting. To understand how deep water ports actually work, it helps to look at one port in particular. Yangshan, built offshore from Shanghai. For decades, Shanghai's port sat on a river that couldn't take the biggest ships. The cargo was there, enormous amounts of it, because the region behind Shanghai was already the world's factory floor. But the water was too shallow to handle the giants, and every box that had to be transferred to smaller ships cost time and money. So China made a decision. Instead of dredging a river that would never be deep enough, they went out into the sea, roughly 20 to 30 kilometers offshore, and built their own islands. They reclaimed land from the ocean, connected it to the mainland with a bridge that runs more than 30 kilometers across open water, and built a brand new deep water port on an island that hadn't existed before. Yangshan opened in phases starting in the mid-2000s, grew to become the largest container port complex in the world, and eventually added a terminal that runs almost entirely automated, cranes and driverless vehicles moving boxes around the clock, with almost no people in sight. At its peak, it's been moving on the order of 20 million boxes a year. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most impressive pieces of infrastructure ever built. But here's what the impressive story hides, and it's the whole point. Yangshan worked because the cargo already existed behind it. The region was already producing the boxes. The bottleneck was the water, not the market. The port didn't create the flow. It released the flow that was already dammed up behind a too shallow river. And that's the answer to the question you're probably asking right now. Sure, that worked in China, with the whole country behind it. And you're right, that's exactly why it worked. Yangshan is not a proof that ports create markets. It's a proof that ports relieve bottlenecks. The Chinese state could throw billions at an island in the sea because the flow behind it was already enormous and growing. The water was the only missing piece. And once they built the deep water, the existing economy poured through it, and even then, with the busiest port region on Earth behind it, the port itself runs on thin margins. Because the value it creates shows up in the region, in the factories and the jobs and the tax base, not on the port's own books. The port is the toll gate on a road that was already full of traffic. That is the single condition under which a deep-water port works: relieve a bottleneck on cargo that already exists. And that is the single condition under which it fails: bet on cargo that doesn't exist yet. The failure mode has a name, and it's not a theory. It's a port on the southern coast of Sri Lanka called Hambantota. In the 2000s, the government decided to build a deep-water port there, on an empty stretch of coast, far from the country's main shipping lanes, far from the big city, far from any existing cargo. The idea was that Hambantota would become a hub, a modern transshipment giant on a major sea route, and that the traffic would come because the port existed. The construction was funded with loans from Chinese state banks, and the price tag came to more than $1 billion, with some estimates closer to $1.5 billion. The port opened in 2010, and the ships did not come. Hambantota was built on a coastline with no hinterland behind it, no factories, no warehouses, no roads feeding it, no cargo trying to get through. The terminal that cost more than $1 billion was handling a handful of ships, sitting almost empty, while the interest on those loans kept coming due, month after month, whether a single box moved or not. By 2017, the government couldn't carry the debt anymore, and it handed the port over to a Chinese state-owned operator on a 99-year lease. The country that built the deep-water port didn't end up owning it. It ended up owning it. It ended up owing for it. That is the ghost port, and it's the clearest, most expensive lesson in this entire industry. You can build the perfect water, and if the flow isn't there, you've built a monument to a bet that didn't come in. And here's the part that should worry anyone watching this industry from the outside. The same bet is being made right now, at a scale Hambantota never approached. Off the coast of India, on an island called Great Nicobar, the government is building Galathea Bay, an international transshipment port, designed to handle nearly 12 million boxes a year, with a price tag around $5 to $6 billion, financed at roughly 70% debt to 30% equity through a joint venture. Transshipment is the riskiest flavor of this business, because a transshipment hub has no city behind it. It doesn't serve a region that's already producing cargo. It exists purely to move boxes between big ships and small ships, which means its entire reason for being is convincing the shipping lines to picket over a dozen other empty coastlines trying to do the exact same thing. The people building Galathea Bay believe the flow will come because the location sits on a major sea route. The people who built Hambantota believed the same thing. The difference between those two bets won't be visible for a decade, and that's the whole problem with this business. You don't find out if you made the right call until long after the concrete is dry and the interest has been running for years. Now, the other side of that same coin, because there is a price for not building too, and it's a tax the economy never counts. Look at the ports that choke on their own cargo. For years, the main port complex in Lagos, Nigeria, was a bottleneck so severe that ships waited at anchorage for weeks, sometimes months, just for a berth. Trucks queued for miles outside the gates. Containers sat for weeks before they moved. Goods rotted inside boxes that never got unloaded. That congestion isn't an inconvenience, it's a cost paid by every business behind the dock, silently, in lost time and lost money, every single day. Some estimates put the price of that choke in the billions of dollars a year to the Nigerian economy, though nobody can count it exactly, because it never shows up on a single invoice. It just shows up as a factory that can't get its parts, a shop that can't get its stock, a clothing brand waiting on a season that's already over, a construction company paying penalties on steel it ordered 6 months ago. Every one of those businesses is paying the port's tax, whether it ever sees the bill or not, and a price that's a little higher because moving a box through that port took 3 times as long as it should have. A bad port costs more than a good port does, which is exactly why countries spend billions to build deep water, not because the port itself is a fortune, but because the alternative is a throttle on the whole economy. So here's the honest answer to whether building a deep water port works. It depends entirely on which bet you're making. In the optimistic scenario, you're building deep water in front of an economy that's already producing boxes, and your port is the missing bottleneck, the thing that releases flow that was already trying to move. The ships call, the volume climbs, the region behind you grows, and the port, even on thin margins, becomes a machine that pays for itself through the sheer scale of what moves through it. That's the bet Shanghai made, and it's the bet that turned a reclaimed island into the busiest port on Earth. In the realistic bad scenario, you're building deep water in front of a market that doesn't exist yet, betting that the factories and the roads and the customers will arrive because you built the dock. And sometimes they do, slowly, painfully, over decades, and sometimes they don't. Hambantota is the version where they didn't. And here's the cruel math that sits underneath both scenarios. The bills don't shrink when the ships stop coming. The dredging still has to happen. The security still has to patrol. The cranes still need maintenance. A port's costs are tied to the size of the channel and the terminal, not to how many boxes move through it, which means a bad year doesn't just cut your revenue. It cuts your revenue and leaves the entire bill standing, and the smaller the port, the thinner the cushion, which is why the ghost stories in this industry are never about the giants. They're about the ports that were big enough to cost a fortune and small enough to drown in it. And the difference between those two outcomes is not the depth of the water, it's the depth of the flow behind it, and you don't control any of it. Not the shipping lines that decide whether to call, not the economy that produces the boxes, not the trucks and trains that bring them to your gate. All you control is the concrete, the cranes, the channel, and the interest clock that starts the day the money arrives. So if you do decide to build a deep water container port, understand what you're actually building. You're not building a dock. You're not even building a port. You're building a funnel. And a funnel is only worth what flows through it. The water was never the hard part. The water is just the pipe. The hard part is everything that decides whether anything flows through it. The factories behind the road, the ships on the map, the customers at the end of the line. The port isn't the business. The flow is the business. And the people who understand that before they pour the first bucket of concrete are the ones who end up with a machine, the ones who don't end up with a monument. The difference between those two endings is not measured in feet of water or tons of steel. It's measured in a single question, the same question you should have asked the day you first stood on that coastline. What's already trying to get through here?